All right, your last Art Humanities lesson. So this is following up what we just finished with mid 20th century and going to stuff being made today. So the first one I wanted to show you was Thomas Mangelson. He's a very famous photographer. I posted this really cool video. It's really short about him working. He's done a lot of famous photographs that have been in, National Geographic, been on TV, including this one. He's, very, very nature based. Then that moves to Ansel Adams. So he's an American black and white photographer, primarily known for his pictures of Yosemite National Park and other places in the western U.S. Um, and Ansel Adams, he's really interesting because he would climb up these giant mountains and things like that, hike to these places people had never been, and sit there all day long until he got the light how he wanted it, take a couple of pictures, and then leave. And this is a different time period where it wasn't a digital camera. He couldn't just look and see if the picture looked well. So he would have to take these back to his studio, develop them, and kind of cross his fingers and hope everything went right. So really, really incredible photos, especially to think about how he couldn't edit these during this time. There was no Photoshop; these were just straight from the camera. Okay, and then that moves to Robert Smithson. So this is called the Spiral Jetty. So he made this out of all these different rocks. And what's really funny is that depending on the time of the year, people will travel here to look at this, and the water will be so high they can't find it. Then you have Chuck Close. So both of these are paintings. These are both self-portraits. He's really interesting because he's a quadriplegic, so he can't fully move his arms or his legs. Um, and that happened later in his life. And what he ended up doing is he built this giant contraption where he can raise and lower these giant canvases, and he has this paintbrush kind of attached to his arm, and he kind of just moves his arm around and makes these colors. So it's pretty incredible. Here it is. He also did a presidential portrait of Bill Clinton. Then you have some famous architects, Utzon, who did the Sydney Opera House, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, who did the famous Sears Tower or Willis Tower in Chicago, Frank Gehry. This is also in Chicago. The first one I really want to talk about is Basquiat. So he's an American graffiti artist and painter who worked out of New York City. His work focused on wealth versus poverty, integration versus segregation, and inner versus outer experience. He lived most of his life homeless, which was really interesting. He would, find cardboard to paint on and kind of hustle his way around New York City trying to get the materials that he could to make his artwork. This is a portrait of Andy Warhol, so someone he knew really well. Now, this one's really, really interesting. So this just became the most expensive work by an American artist sold at auction just recently. So this sold in 2017 for 110.4 million. It's the most expensive work by an artist of African descent sold at auction. It's the most expensive work made since 1980 sold at auction. It's the sixth most expensive work ever sold at auction. And then one of only 10 paintings in the auction's history to surpass 100 million. Okay, next up, David Hockney. So he focused on kind of, what you would think of as the 60s, the pop art movement. Very bright, vibrant colors. And if you notice, a lot of his artworks have multiple panels put together to create these. Then we move on to Christian and Jean-Claude, which they both just passed away recently. But their whole idea was that they were environmental artists, and they covered these large areas out of these special made fabrics that they would create. And they made their art and paid for it by selling drawing ideas and collages and other stuff. And sometimes the public would help fund it. But their whole idea is that they wanted to make things that you would typically not pay attention to stand out. Um, so, for example, people walked over this bridge every day, millions of times by millions of people. And with it covered like this, it transforms into something new and interesting to look at. Same for this hillside. Um, they did they chose these 11 islands in Florida years ago and surrounded them with over 6.5 million square feet of pink fabric. It's kind of an aerial view. And these are all temporary. They don't last very long. They'll pull them back up after maybe a week or so. Here's one of their sketches. These are all trees covered by this. And then this is probably their most famous piece. This was in New York City in Central Park. They covered all of the walking areas with these flags. They also tied a similar kind of fabric in between this interstate, and you could actually drive under it. This is one of their last pieces that they made. You could actually go from this outside part and walk across this water out to this house. They covered this castle in fabric. All right, Calder. So he's the guy who created kind of the mobile, so kind of what you think of, babies having hanging above their cribs. But he does these large scale ones. So these are really, really big. In DC, they actually built a whole building around one. So here's a big one. And these all spin, and each piece spins individually. Damien Hirst. Now, Damien Hirst is really controversial. A lot of people either love him or hate him. He's a living English artist that became prominent in the 90s. Most of his work is focused on death. So this is a real shark that you're seeing dipped in formaldehyde. So he hired people to kill this shark. And the whole idea is that when you go into an art museum, you're typically going to look at, paintings and drawings and sculptures and things like that. And his idea was that he wanted you to walk into this gallery and be face to face with a shark, something that no one else would be face to face with unless they were about to die. He's also worked with different hotels in Las Vegas. So these paintings are also his. He also designed hotel rooms with all of his artwork. He does these spiral paintings. This is one of his most expensive pieces. So this is an actual human skull. So platinum cast of an 18th century human skull with 8,601 diamonds. The teeth are real from the original skull, and he sold this for over $100 million. Some of his spot paintings, more sculptures. These are all real animals. These are his pieces made out of flies. So again, the whole idea of death. Now this one's really interesting because this is supposed to be kind of the life cycle of an insect. So what happens is these flies fly out of here and they can go into this next little area, and they have the option of either landing in and kind of eating off of this cow head, or you can watch them die when they hit this bug zapper. And you can see these little holes right here. They're not big enough for the flies to get through, but they're big enough so that you can smell the death when you walk into the room. Now, these pieces, they look like stained glass windows, but they're actually entirely made out of real butterflies. And the colors are all real. They're all natural. This is one of his latest pieces from his series about he made up this fake shipwreck, and with all of these designs and these giant sculptures. And when he promoted it, they put out this video that he found this shipwreck and all this crazy artwork. And then he ended up coming out and saying, he made it up. All right, next up is Banksy. Banksy's really interesting because no one knows who it is in the whole world. Um, they know that it's a man because he's done some interviews and put them out. He has a team that helps him, but they all, sign non-disclosure agreements. They don't talk about him. But a lot of his stuff is satirical. He kind of makes fun of different situations. So, for example, in this country, all of these guards were searching these little girls for weapons, and he thought that was ridiculous. So he flew to this city and kind of did this spray paint that kind of reversed the situation. This one's really interesting because this was kind of it. It was kind of like the Berlin Wall, where the wall was separating this city. And if you notice this hole right here, when he was painting these, the guards came and started shooting at him to stop. And what's really interesting with Banksy is he likes to pick places that aren't that popular, aren't that famous. If he went to Lexington, he wouldn't go next to the Blue Building and do a painting. He would pick, a random spot that no one really knows. And that's usually to bring attention to, an area of town that's not really widely known. He also likes to do a lot of charity work where he will go into, or at least one of his team members will go into kind of a thrift shop, and they will just take one of the random paintings that's there. And what will happen is he will add his own addition to it. So, for example, he put this Nazi soldier on here, give it back to the place, and then they will auction it off and raise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. He's snuck into art museums before and put fake art up on the walls without people knowing. In New York a few years ago, for 30 straight days, he did artworks all over the city and never got caught, even though there was a huge manhunt for him. This is his most famous piece, There's Always Hope, the famous balloon girl. And then a few years ago, someone tried to sell a print of this, and he actually snuck a shredder inside. And when they auctioned it off, someone was sitting in the audience, pushed a button, and shredded it right in person. And if you notice, a lot of his stuff is usually trying to say something. All right, next up, Jeff Koons. So all of his work is based on kind of childhood and taking these objects like balloon animals and blowing them up. So at one point, this was the most expensive artwork by a living artist, almost $60 million. Now this one is the most expensive artwork by a living artist for $91.1 million. This is his giant Play-Doh sculpture. This is made out of aluminum. Puppy, entirely made out of flowers. So this blooms and dies each year, so it always looks different. And this is out in Spain. He created the album cover for Lady Gaga, so this is a sculpture that he made. This isn't a picture. This giant ballerina that he did for New York. All right, and now I want to talk about Kehinde Wiley. He's by far the most famous African American artist probably ever, especially working right now. This is a really cool video of him kind of discussing his process. But what he does is he likes to take old classical artworks that are typically of white men and depict them with modern day men, usually people of color. So, you'll see a bunch of different examples of that. But this one's supposed to be Napoleon. His stuff is very detailed and very, very large. And he always takes these photos of people off the streets and puts them into his paintings. So notice the details all throughout the hands. It's really, really interesting stuff. And this is his most famous work. He did the presidential portrait for Obama. And you'll see there's a ton of symbolism here. Everything about this painting has some kind of symbolism to it. And, when this was unveiled, a lot of people didn't like it because this is what presidential portraits were like until he did his. It's very colorful. It's his style. And on the opposite end of that, we have Amy Sherrill. She also got famous from doing presidential portrait, but she did hers of Michelle Obama. So she's the first African American artist commissioned to paint a presidential portrait along with Kehinde Wiley. She uses a gray palette for her subject matter to challenge the concept of color as race. So that's her portrait of Michelle Obama. Now, her work's really interesting and her story's really interesting because for the longest time, she was struggling to make ends meet. She had to have surgery at one point, which kind of put her in major debt. She wasn't getting any work. And then Michelle Obama found her work, um, hired her, and now she's one of the most famous artists alive. She actually did the Vanity Fair cover this past year of Breonna Taylor, which you may have seen. All right, Takashi Murakami. So he's a Japanese contemporary artist who turned his artwork into a successful collectible and valuable toy brand. He's also done work with Kanye. He did his album cover. He's worked with Billie Eilish on her music videos and clothing line. Then we get to Baryshnikov. He's a famous Russian ballet dancer. He was an actor in the show Sex and the City at one point. Very, very amazing ballet dancer. Highly recommend you look him up. And that's it.